Hello and welcome to this very special interview. I am Wheels from Dicebreaker, dicebreaker.com and youtube.com/Dicebreaker. I'm joined by a bit of a iconic figure in the British games industry, Mr. Ian Livingstone. Would you like to introduce yourself to those at home who may not have heard of you before?
Hello, my name's Ian, as was just told to you. I've been a games player and a games maker for some 45 years, I guess. Started a company called Games Workshop in 1975 with two old school friends, Steve Jackson and John Peake. And we wanted to turn our hobby of playing games into making them. First off, launching Dungeons and Dragons and later on Warhammer. I also was the co-creator of Fighting Fantasy game books that went on to sell 20 million copies globally. I moved into video games, first as a designer in the mid-80s, creating a game called Eureka for a startup publisher developer called Domark, and I joined that company after selling out a workshop in the early 90s. And those Domark and three other companies got put together, merged effectively to create Newco IDOS Interactive, and there we launched Tomb Raider, Lara Croft. And when IDOS was acquired in 2013 by Square Enix of Japan, I left to become an indie investor. And I've invested in quite a lot of startups and seed companies like Playdemic and Mediatonic. And more recently, I've also become chairman of Sumo Group, based in Sheffield, a premier developer of amazing content. And last but not least, two things. Hero Capital, a partner of a venture capital company investing in video games, and also starting up my own school, the Livingstone Academy in Bournemouth, which is going to try and make people work ready and world ready for a world that's being transformed by technology. So it'll be a lot around digital creativity and using games as a contextual hub for learning.
Well, I think that gives a pretty good idea for those who might not be as familiar with your whole body of work that you have quite a far reach in the UK games industry
Well, it's been a
and
long
beyond.
time,
Yeah.
45 years.
So we'll start at the beginning then, because 2018 we celebrated 40 years of Games Workshop. For those of you who are familiar, Games Workshop, you may know them more recently for the Warhammer franchise, massive tabletop miniatures game, but also spreading out into all kinds of video game adaptations and everything like that. But also, it started off as more of a role playing game company.
Yes, well, it actually started in 1975 when we founded the company in a flat in Shepherd's Bush, and three school friends, Steve, John, and I, had pretty boring jobs and not much money. We used to stay in and playing our hobby, which was playing board games. And we thought, how could we possibly turn this into a business of sorts? So we decided to reach out and try and make contact with other board gamers around the UK. So we published our own little fanzine called Owl and Weasel. And we only printed like 200 copies and sent them out to everybody we knew in games. And one of the copies found its way onto the desk of Gary Gygax in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And he just invented a game called Dungeons and Dragons. He wrote to us enclosing a copy of the game, and we opened it up. It didn't look like very much. Pretty simple box with a very mediocre illustration on the front and three rule books inside. But when you played the game, it opened up your imagination like no game had ever done before. And of course, I don't think any game ever will again. This is the very first role-playing game set in a fantasy world where we take on the roles of heroes and wizards and fighters and clerics and go on these fantastic journeys of the mind. And we ordered 6 copies of D&D, and on the back of that rather paltry offer, we were given a 3-year exclusive distribution agreement for the whole of Europe, because Gary was also operating out of his flat in Lake Geneva. So we were kind of both being role-playing people around role-playing businessmen around a role-playing game, which was quite funny, really. But it was quite a struggle at the beginning. John left after a year. He didn't like role-playing games at all, and Steve and I were completely obsessed by D&D. And so we started off our little fledgling games company and went to the States, signed up all the new companies that were coming online in the role-playing and miniatures hobby. And we had nowhere to live because we'd left our flat, and we went to the bank and tried to borrow some money from the bank manager, and he looks at you rather like a dog watching television, has no understanding whatsoever what you're talking about when you're trying to explain Dungeons and Dragons to him. So we were actually forced to live in a van for 3 months. But I guess, when you are following your own destiny and doing something because you really want to, it didn't really seem like hardship. And ultimately, we opened our very first shop in 1978. I think that's where people assume that's where it all started. But we'd already had 3 years of pretty tough times before that. But when our first shop opened in April '78, I guess that was a big turning point for us. And of course, after role-playing games of D&D, we moved ultimately to pivot the company around Warhammer.
Yeah, and we fast forward now to 40 years later, and Games Workshop as a company is now bigger than Rolls-Royce, as bumping
Some
up
might
against
say we sold out a little bit early in 1991. But we kind of watch like proud parents of the incredible continued success of Workshop. It is now worth over £3.4 billion on the London Stock Exchange, as you say. Bigger than most of the household names we talk about, with Marks and Spencers, Peter Jones, and Rolls-Royce. But it's an extraordinary achievement, and it just goes to show the power of play. And we all love playing games, and if you hit the sweet spot with a franchise, i.e. Warhammer, you can do amazing things. But Games Workshop is not just a games retailer. It's I like to try and think that we set that ball in motion of creating a Games Workshop experience. We didn't hire traditional retailers to run our shops. We hired hobbyists like ourselves, and whilst they might have looked like Visigoths, their knowledge and passion for the games that we sold were instrumental in drawing in like-minded people into the shop to play and learn how to paint and just participate in that wonderful experience.
So how does it feel to look at the sheer dwarfing the company as it is now today has upon the original image of two friends in a van selling copies of the original Dungeons and Dragons? As a sort of retrospective thought, what's it like to look back at that journey and try to comprehend how much has happened since then?
Well, clearly we had no idea it could ever reach this size or potential. I mean, not in our wildest dreams would we have ever thought it was possible. And we'd also seen video games appearing, and so that kind of thought in our minds would have thought, well, maybe Workshop wouldn't grow as quickly as we wanted it to. But looking back now, you can see why it's so successful. Having everyone, boys in particular, enjoy playing with toy soldiers, and toy soldiers in the 21st century of kind of space marines and fantastical figures. It's just it just hits so many buttons, and the hobby aspect of painting the miniatures and talking about the games in White Dwarf magazine, and it's a pure hobby, and it's a bit like model railways in the past, that people couldn't always afford to buy a train, but they would always be able to buy some little bit of scenery or some paint. And it's the same with Workshop. You can always add to your hobby, and it's always a joy going into the shops to find out what's new and what's exciting in the hobby. But looking back, it's just bizarre to see what started as such a tiny, undercapitalized company in the 1970s has become this sort of megalithic giant of the games industry, and long may it continue. I think it's great that games are beginning to eat the world.
Well, so you sort of touched briefly on the philosophy that you had for the original retail experience that Games Workshop had, with that idea that when you went into the shop, you were not talking to someone who was just trying to sell you something, but you were talking to someone who was deeply ingrained in the hobby and wanted you to join in. Do you feel like that sort of philosophy has led to this now almost like lifestyle brand that Games Workshop has become?
Well, I'm no longer involved with the company, as I said, and we sold out in 1991. But I think our spirit lives on in the way the shops operate. What the major difference, of course, is that we used to stock just about every role-playing game in the universe. And it was the shops, and White Dwarf was focused on role-playing games, war games, science fiction games, fantasy games, magazines, and the decision was made for Workshop to zero in 100% on its own intellectual property, i.e. Warhammer, White Dwarf, and Citadel. There was a lot of discontent at the time from some customers saying, why have all these other games that they love so much not appearing in the shops anymore? But from a commercial standpoint, it was clearly the right decision, because many companies back in the 80s and 90s have long gone out of business, and workshops have been able to maintain and, in fact, of course, grow at a phenomenal rate because of its decision to concentrate on its own IP. And you build value in companies if you do own your own intellectual property, because you're not depending on a license. When we lost the Dungeons and Dragons license in 1978, why was that? It was because TSR, the company that owned D&D, wanted to merge with Workshop, and Steve and I, being kind of independently minded young Brits, didn't want to merge our companies. But that meant, of course, that we lost the exclusivity of D&D in Europe. And whilst we remained the largest distributor, it was no longer our product. And if you do want to determine your own destiny and build value in your company, it's hugely beneficial to own your own IP. Thus, Workshop has proved that with Warhammer.
I mean, we've kind of seen Warhammer as not just like you said, that they focused on their own IP, and now that universe or multiple universes that they've created has almost become sort of a pop culture phenomenon as well. Did you feel back in those early days that with things like 40k and Warhammer Fantasy that you're really onto something from a sort of like a lore and story perspective?
Well, Warhammer actually came out of Citadel. It wasn't Steve or my idea. What we wanted was a game to replace Dungeons and Dragons, which was our bread and butter product. We wanted an IP that would become, not just a brand, a franchise, but a major IP, which could be commercial in itself, but also ultimately through licensing and merchandising have incremental revenues that would build awareness and also generate revenues from areas where Workshop wasn't involved. So whether it's from video games or films or merchandise, of course, that would help market and also create revenue.
So, well, let's move on to some of the other projects that you've worked on then. So in 1982, we get the first fighting fantasy book come out, which is a series that, I mean, especially for myself, I remember reading them as a kid in school. Not to put a big age gap between us, but
Don't worry, I've got an age gap with everybody.
But now the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, that first book is quite culturally important now. What were the roots of that game book? Where did that idea sort of come from, and how did it gestate in the end?
Well, in the early days of Workshop, and we used to run Games Days, the first one in 1975, and Games Day 79, we were inviting other companies to have stands at Games Day, and one of the stands was Penguin Books, and the editor who was behind the stand was bemused by the fact by thousands of people in the event hall, I think it was the Royal Horticultural Hall, were obsessing around Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. And she spoke to Steve and I and said, this is an incredible phenomenon. Would you consider ever writing a book about role-playing games? And we said, well, rather than writing a book about role-playing games, why don't we write a book that gives you an experience of a role-playing game without really knowing what we were going to do? And she liked that idea and said, please send a synopsis in. And so we went back and thought about it, and we came up with this working title, The Magic Quest, and how it could be an interactive book with the book replacing the Dungeon Master, but having kind of multiple choice, but attaching a simple game system to make it but more like a role-playing game rather than just a branching narrative. And she loved the idea, but she had a tough time at Penguin Books trying to convince her peers to buy into it. Apparently, the managing director of Penguin Books almost banged his head on the table when told about this idea of an interactive books. He said, how would anyone want to play through a book making choices when, of course, your imagination has to be best used by following a traditional linear book. Anyway, long story short, Geraldine fought our corner, and in 1982, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain came out, but not with much fanfare. The marketing powers at Penguin didn't really know what they had on their hands, and they only did a small print run. But it began to gain traction in playgrounds in certain parts of the country. We promoted it in White Dwarf magazine. We were very proud of seeing our little book on the shelves of W.H. Smith's, and within a quite short period of time, the news spread kind of nationwide. And but Penguin still didn't have religion about the books, and they reprinted some 11 times in the first couple of months until Geraldine very proudly came on the phone and said, "We want 2 more." And Steve wrote Citadel of Chaos, and I wrote Forest of Doom. But they were not without some negativity being attached around them. The Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide about them, saying having children, if they're going to read these books interacting with ghouls and demons, they're bound to get possessed by the devil. A worried housewife in deepest suburbia phoned up a local radio station, said having read one of her books, her child levitated. So the kids are thinking, for £1.50, can we fly? That's amazing. The local vicar at Penguin Books threatened to chain himself to the railings until they were banned. There was petitions sent in by parents, magazine articles saying that children are using their imaginations too much, until some teachers started to say, actually, these are very good for reluctant readers, short attention span, great for improving literacy, critical thinking, because you're trying to find the optimal way through the book. Long story short, they sold 20 million copies globally, the series to date. Because why were they so successful? Because, as we all know, a typical book is a linear experience. You have no control of where the story's going to go, or whether you like the hero or heroine. And of course, Fighting Fantasy game books, you, the reader, are the hero. You make all the choices. 400 paragraphs, branching narrative, you taking control. And giving the reader agency is very powerful. And letting them make all decisions is something that children love to do. And so I think they very much speak to the video games generation, of course, because everything they do is interactive. And of course, these books are interactive. So with hindsight, there's no surprise that Fighting Fantasy were so successful. But they've always had their detractors because of that word game, which also send people into an apoplectic frenzy, whereas thinking about the positives about games, and in video games in particular, the criticism they've had over the years, I think, is totally unjustified. I really believe in games as a force for good. The power of play, I think, is really positive. I mean, if you park your prejudice against 1 or 2 titles and think cognitively what happens when you're playing a game, problem solving. You cannot get through a game without problem solving. You learn intuitively. No one forces you to play. You learn how to play on your own. You can fail in a safe environment. Games like Minecraft just show how amazingly creative the games are, building these wonderful 3D architectural worlds like digital Lego, sharing them with your friends. Games are effectively a simulation. Roller Coaster Tycoon, understanding the physics of building the rides, the economy of pricing the rides, the staffing levels required to operate those rides. And if you do it right, you feel great. If you do it wrong, you're not punished like you are in an examination. You're encouraged to try again. And over time, everyone can become a winner. So I think games, as I said earlier, as a contextual hub for learning in a kind of cross-curricular way, is a great way of engaging with today's children.
Well, I mean, so we've actually seen a a recent sort of resurgence of that kind of interactive fiction. So I personally used to work for a company called Inkle, which are now, they've put out Steve Jackson's Sorcery series. They're working on all sorts of innovations in that field. But you've also got those physical products are still a big thing, especially on the RPG space. So we recently had a game called 1,000-Year-Old Vampire that uses that sort of turn to this page kind of formula to have a more open-ended experience. Is this something that you keep up with now as one of the sort of pioneers almost of this genre?
Well, I think interactivity outside of video games is appearing in many ways. You've seen Bandersnatch having huge success and awareness in the media about interactive television, for want of a better expression. And yet the choices were quite limited, but it shows again the power of choice. Giving people agency is a very compelling thing, and you've seen branching appear in other media we've never expected. There's a company I'm connected with called Flavorworks that's used touch with video as well to make not just branching video in itself, but also adding a touch sequence so you can actually interact with physical components within that experience. So there's many applications for branching, and long may it continue. I've never made it my business to read anybody else's branching narrative books because I don't want to be ever accused of copying other people's ideas. So I steer well clear of other people's books. But I do really welcome continued innovation in the space.
Well, I suppose it's almost difficult to avoid now with the prevalence of choice being in the media we consume. I mean, even advertising now seems to have some kind of choose your own path narrative to it.
Well, everybody, I think, sees the value, the stickiness you get through interactivity, and children of today want all their screens to be interactive, including their televisions. So if you keep serving them linear entertainment and linear messaging, they're not going to be as engaged as they would within interactive media. So it's no surprise that advertising and other media want to gamify their experiences and product offerings.
So, I mean, it's worth noting that you're still creating these interactive books. So, Assassins of Alancia, for Fighting Fantasy, came out in 2019. Is it still as much of a draw for you to create these books as it was back in the day?
It's a complete passion project. Fighting Fantasy is so close to my heart. To have had such a powerful effect on kids in the 80s and 90s, in that they love them today. Fighting Fantasy survived a generation, and survived the test of time is really heartwarming, and I feel quite humble to hear some of the comments and read some of the comments online, what people say about what an impact Fighting Fantasy had on their lives that made them the people that they are today. And clearly it still resonates with a large audience, as children who read them in the 80s now have their own children and kind of passing the baton to a new generation of readers. And I'm delighted that they're still relevant in this technologically driven 21st century interactive world. So I'm never going to stop writing. I mean, I've just turned 70, so it might take longer to write, but it's absolutely have plans for a new title for the 40th anniversary, which will be in 2022.
So if we take it back a step again, just when Fighting Fantasy was just starting to really bring some credence to its name and become like a bit of a cultural event almost in the space that it operated in. At the same time, you were still, as I understand it, still working on Games Workshop and everything else that was entailing, including the Warhammer franchise. But they always stayed two separate projects. Was there any sort of temptation to merge the two as to ostensibly, apart from a few outliers, mainly fantasy titles?
Well, Fighting Fantasy was our idea to broaden the appeal of role-playing and therefore it needed to be delivered at scale into outlets that Workshop had no connection with, i.e. bookshops. And so we didn't feel it would work well through just Games Workshop shops in themselves, because in the 1980s we didn't have that many. Of course, we had trade customers to whom we sold our merchandise too, but if you wanted to get real mass market penetration, it had to be with a global publisher, and that's why we went to Penguin Books. So we retained the IP ownership of Fighting Fantasy, and Penguin did the publishing, whilst we also continued to operate and own Games Workshop. So they were quite different offerings at the time. I mean, there might be some close associations today, but at the time we needed the power of a traditional book publisher to move what was then just purely physical products around the world.
So, moving on to video games. So this is, of course, a digital tabletop event. So it's good to talk about how the tabletop space has influenced and moved into digital spaces. So Games Workshop have obviously did bits with this in the area back in the 80s, and you did some work at developers / publisher Domark that you talked about briefly earlier. So do you think Games Workshop itself, back in the early days when the digital realm was really becoming a force to be reckoned with, what was do you think the thing that stopped Games Workshop really grabbing it by the reins and from the off becoming a digital company as much as it was a tabletop one?
Well, I think it was a question of focus and also available capital. We'd had a couple of forays in with computer games. We'd published some of our own for Sinclair and Commodore 64. We'd also sold at retail Activision and early console and cartridges, but we were also on the wrong side of the 1983 crash. We were left with a lot of inventory in the stores. So with the kind of limited team that we had in the early days, we decided we should do what we were best at, which was role-playing games, miniature figures, and White Dwarf magazine, and just focus on that rather than moving into computer games and having to have a whole new skill set and distribution mechanism. So we just decided at that point that we would, if we had IP that could be turned into a video game, that we should license it rather than try and do it ourselves.
So whilst it maybe stopped Games Workshop from jumping into that space, you yourself weren't deterred, as obviously we moved on to the almost cultural icon now that we have standing behind you, firing off a pistol. Back in the 90s, you joined Domark, which is purchased by IDOS and then releases Tomb Raider. And suddenly, we're in the era of the PlayStation, and games are really becoming a massive mainstream thing. Can you talk us through that period of video games becoming more mainstream, more of a phenomenon in household spaces, and with Lara Croft, a character that you were so close to, almost being a vanguard of that as well?
Yes, well, Steve and I sold out of Workshop finally in 1991, and I'd designed the launch product for Domark, which was Eureka in 1984, but I maintained contact with them for those years. I invested in the company because whilst I was co-owner of Workshop, I didn't want to ignore the video games industry. So in the 80s, I said I invested in Domark, and when having sold out of Workshop, I was invited to join the board of Domark. And as you say, Domark in the end merged with three other companies to create a new company, IDOS, which floated on the stock exchange in '95, and I became executive chairman of the group. But it wasn't until 1996 that IDOS really took off. At the time, it had in its portfolio, perhaps the most famous title was Championship Manager, and a few other titles that were less known. But we had an opportunity to acquire Centergold, the only other company, public company listed, which was involved with video games. And my task was really to have a look at all the studios and games in their portfolio to see if it was worthwhile acquiring the company. And I remember going to Derby where to meet Jeremy Heath Smith, who was the managing director of Core Design, the developers of a significant part of Senegal's portfolio. And he took me around the studio, and I saw all the games of developers, and thought they were all pretty good until the very last room. And I guess in a corny way, you could say it was love at first sight, because there was this amazing 3D character moving into the screen into a 3D world which I hadn't seen before, and incredible graphics and and technology was making this happen, that you can control this character, but it wasn't a male character as would be expected at that time. This was a female character. This was Lara Croft, and it was just an incredible moment to see what this team had achieved. A small team of, I think, some 6 people with the technology, the graphics, the Lara Croft herself, the problem solving, the adventuring, the combat, the puzzle solving. It's like all the planets were were aligned, and I raced back, and we had a very quick discussion that we must buy Sensible, which we did. And of course, Tomb Raider was launched in October '96, and I think we had something like 50 to 100,000 units in our budget of expected sales, and we went on to sell 7 million copies. So, games have this amazing ability to surprise you. We thought Tomb Raider would be a great seller, but never at that scale. And Lara Croft kind of transcended the games industry and became a mass cultural icon. And of course, 2 films with starring Angelina Jolie helped widen that awareness of Tomb Raider and Lara Croft. And you could see back in those days that games had the capacity to grab the hearts and minds of huge audiences. And whilst the media remained quite critical of the medium at the time, always saying games are addictive, or there's too much violence in them, people who've grown up with games never had that sense. They always saw games as being not just fun to play, but actually, as I said earlier, good for them in multiple ways. And we've seen now today, of course, that games are almost in danger of being socially acceptable to an industry that's some $220 billion a year in revenue, 3 billion people playing, hundreds of millions of people watching, because games have become not just a spectator sport, but esports tournaments within games, streamers. It's a phenomenal. It's the largest entertainment industry in the world. But back then, it was a bit of a struggle trying to get connection with media to talk about them in a positive light. And of course, negative sentiment around the industry sent a bad message to parents who would never want their children to join the industry in any capacity. It sent a bad message to investors who wouldn't feel they'd want to invest in UK games companies, and it sent a bad message to government, who were worried about what is this thing that's this phenomenon. And so that's but fast forward to today, games have now been proven to be one of the great success stories in the digital age, and in the post-COVID world, they tick all the right boxes for a networked society in a digital e-commerce world. Regional, government always talking about regional business. Games studios are regional. They're high tech, high growth, high skilled, IP creating, green. What's not to like?
Touching on that, we very much saw most of up until now, up until what we've spoken about now. A lot of your career has been very firmly placed in sort of British industry, right? So we've Games Workshop being one of the the pinnacle big British gaming companies, Lara Croft being a very important cultural British icon as well. But then after a few other sort of like large business moves for IDOS or EDOS rather, then Square Enix eventually acquires it, and suddenly you're working in a very sort of global real estate. Suddenly, a Japanese company owning a British one with a British figure, but being published all over the world. What was the jump like to go from a very sort of small scale English company to suddenly having a completely global audience of global teams and people all over the world contributing?
Well, IDOS, I wouldn't say it was small scale. It was the largest publisher of games in the UK, and at one point had a market valuation on the stock exchange of approaching £1 billion. But it had a series of events whereby the value of the company declined over a rather short period of time, making it a target for acquisition. First, SCI bought the company, and then Square Enix bought IDOS from SCI, and not really being. I still had kind of my Games Workshop mentality of being independent. I don't think I was the right person to stay on to fit into a corporate Japanese company. So not long after acquisition, I did decide to leave and become an investor, move from being an entrepreneur to an investor. So that's when I started investing in UK indie studios, and I've really enjoyed doing that, and had some good successes from as one of the seed investors in Playdemic that created the global mobile hit Golf Clash. I was also an investor in Mediatonic, of course, created Fall Guys, and investor in Fusebox, who do the Love Island game, and several others. And of course, last but not least, investor in Sumo, who is now a PLC listed on AIM, and I'm happy to be delighted and honoured to be the non-executive chairman of Sumo. But getting back to your point about IDOS, it was a very significant company, and being acquired was, it was very disappointing. The stock exchange, the investors had kind of almost given up on IDOS when effectively issued a sort of profit warning. The fact that a game had been delayed from one quarter to the next for the right reason. We wanted it to be the best game it could possibly be, but it wasn't quite in the state that we wanted it when our results were announced, and therefore that made us a target for an acquisition. But of course, as a games creator today, I don't think there's been a better time. Back in the IDOS days, when games were effectively a premium product sold at retail, and it wasn't a direct-to-consumer proposition, you had to manage the supply chain, and it was a fixed product. You couldn't adapt it over time. It was locked inside a CD. And if it wasn't up to expectations, you'd get all that back in inventory. But today, of course, games as a service, often free at the point of delivery. The game that's being played 12 months after release is going to be quite different from one that is released. And through analytics, metrics, and data, and understanding of consumer behavior, you can improve products over time. Plus, there's no inventory risk. You can reach global audiences directly on day one, be it the App Store, Epic Store, Steam, Digital Console, whatever publishing platform you choose. There has certainly never been a better time to make and publish games to global audiences. It might be very, very competitive, but any successful is always going to be competitive.
So you've had quite a sort of a long career of being in at the ground floor of quite exciting and revolutionary things happening in the games industry. Now that you've moved into that sort of investor space, are there sort of like skills or key things that you look for that you've picked up via that career of yours that you you
Yeah.
bring into that investing mindset?
Yeah, I have quite a long checklist of things I look at before I would consider investing. Um, this is a people's business, and you invest in people more than anything else. Of course, when people ask me what's the three most important things about a game, I will say gameplay, gameplay, gameplay. Technology and graphics are hugely important, but they will also play a supporting role to the gameplay itself. But forgetting about the gameplay, right, that's not the most important thing in terms of investing in a studio on day one. I want to meet the team, the senior leadership team, the co-founders. Are they able to execute on ideas? Is the managing director, for want of a better expression, on equal partnership terms with the creative director? Because it's that team of business and creativity that's going to make things happen. Not just creating the game itself. How are you going to get to market? How are you going to monetize? And all the business decisions that have to go around that. So number one for me is the team, and then you start to drill down on the IP, on the technology, around the business model, around monetization, acquisition of users, retention and monetization of users, technology stacks, back-end server technology, addressable markets, on and on and on until I can get comfort and satisfaction. But of course, to make any investment decision easier, you need data. Any KPIs from performance of the game is going to be hugely beneficial. So I can't ever see myself, unless it's talking to an experienced team who've left a company to do something new. I can't ever see myself investing in a team that has nothing but a PowerPoint and some profit and loss projections for a game they haven't even started to make yet. That's just all kind of wishful thinking. I need to see some scars on people's backs, see, what they've done to get to the point they are. Therefore, they need to demonstrate technology or some gameplay and some key metrics for me to get really excited, because there's so much competition and barriers to growth. I have to have a firm belief in the team above anything else.
So we've talked a lot about your career in the games industry, all of the amazing projects you've had the pleasure to work on and to be in at the ground floor for. But you make no secret of it that you're not just a businessman. You're very interested in the ideals of how play can help us as humans and as children, things like that. So in 2010, you were asked by the UK government to look at digital skills and how they're taught. And more recently, you're involved in founding a school as well, which we briefly mentioned earlier. So tell us a little bit more about that, and how close that is to your heart, and what do you hope to see from that project?
I guess, to your point about the business, yes, I've learned to become business-minded and business operational. But my love is around the content. I like making games, designing games, playing games. That's my hobby. It's my passion. And I've seen first through Games Workshop, then from Fighting Fantasy, and more recently through video games, what an amazing medium this is to learn in a multidisciplinary way. And the report I co-wrote in 2011, the Next Gen review, was really through a frustration of us, when I was chairman of IDOS, of not being able to hire software engineers in particular of a high enough standard in the UK, and having to outsource or commission overseas companies to do stuff that should really be within our wheelhouse. We are a creative nation. Look at our film, our fashion, our music, our books, our publishing, our architecture, and of course games. And we were also very early adopters of technology, and we had programming in schools in the 80s with the BBC Micro and affordable home computers like the Sinclair Spectrum. And you put technology into the hands of a creative person, a presto, video games. And yet, fast forward to when we wrote the review in 2011, there simply weren't enough software engineers, because the ICT curriculum in schools in particular had not been hijacked, but it'd been moved from creativity to using other people's software. So children were being bored to death learning Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, learning how to use effectively a strange hybrid of Office software instead of creating their own content. So it's effectively teaching them how to read, but not how to write. They could play a game, they couldn't make a game. They could use a website, couldn't build a website. This was insane, given our technological and creative heritage. And so I complained to Ed Vasey, who was culture minister at the time in the government, and he threw it back at me and said, well, rather than complain about it, why don't you write a review about it? And to his credit, he helped get Alex Hope, the co-author of the report, help from Nesta in terms of monetary help and help with drafting the report with two amazing researchers, Hassan Bakshi. And we published a report in 2011 and gave really 20 recommendations, 2 key recommendations in Next Gen. You can still download it from the Nesta website, should you wish. Is that the first one being to have computer science on the national curriculum as a essential discipline, and to have arts included in the English baccalaureate, because over time, arts had become a kind of nice to have rather than a key subject learned at school. And as it didn't count in the league tables, it was often the arts in general were often left as a maybe or a perhaps rather than a must-have. And to my mind, that was crazy. We're trying to strip creativity and diverse thinking out of children's minds when we are thoroughly dependent on that as a nation to differentiate ourselves from other nations. So we, over time, it took quite a few years of lobbying, and it wasn't us, of course. There was a rising noise around this frustration, and for the effect in 2014, the government changed the curriculum. So the ICT, as was taught, was disapplied, and the new computing curriculum came on stream, which is good in many ways, but kind of an opportunity missed in others, is that they still didn't offer the creative component that computers are a tool to be creative. So we're halfway there, but still work needs to be done in the curriculum to make it an exciting subject where children want to create and build digital content. But the key thing for children of the 21st century is that they move from the passenger seat to the driver's seat of technology. They need to be in control and understanding of digital literacy, which is almost, to my mind, as important as literacy and numeracy. So the school I'm going to open in association with Aspirations Academies Trust next year will focus on digital creativity. It will use games-based learning as a contextual hub for children to learn in multidisciplinary ways. And we will focus on computer science in a very creative sense. We will work with industry to give context and application of what children really learn in our lessons, and hopefully make them work ready and world ready for a world that's being transformed by technology. And it's so important for their sakes, for jobs that we can't even dream what those jobs might be, that they are equipped with critical thinking, creativity, and the ability to operate in a world that is going to be completely different from the world I grew up in.
Well, I think we're coming towards the end of this interview. Thanks so much for joining us, Ian. As one final question, I suppose we've been talking about games all this time. We should probably talk about which ones.
Much about games at all, really.
Yeah, which games have you been playing recently, digital or tabletop?
Well, I still play video games I mean, who doesn't? And I still play some classics. I still play Virtua Tennis on a Dreamcast. I still play Advance Wars. I still enjoy playing Civilization. But I've been running a board games group since the 1980s, and Steve Jackson's in that group, and Peter Molyneux, and a couple of others from the games industry. And I publish a newsletter, and it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek newsletter, belittling their achievements of the evening. At the end of the year, we get there's a cup which is engraved with the winner, because I keep a record of all the points scored. However, of course, we've not been able to meet for the last few months. So we've been using Board Game Arena to play board games on, at the same time having a Zoom call so we can kind of give each other abuse at the same time and try and do alliances and deals. So it's been a good substitute for meeting face to face. But the reason why I do enjoy board games is that kind of social interaction around a table of like-minded people. The joy, the becoming the smiling assassin. So games we like playing on, we have been playing on Board Game Arena. I think games like Seven Wonders and Carcassonne, and sometimes we'll play a linked version, an iPad version of Ticket to Ride and other games like that. Not too challenging, but still, great fun to play. Not too long, because half an hour to an hour, I think, is kind of a good time spent in a digital board game online. But board games are certainly very much part of my life, but of course I love playing video games too.
Yeah, it'll be difficult to deny you that with the current backdrop that you're sitting in front of right now.
And it's also great to see the renaissance in board games. It's kind of strange in this digital world we live in that there's been such an uptick in the number of board games consumed. And people ask me sometimes, why is that happening? I think it's really for three reasons: kind of e-commerce, YouTube, and Kickstarter. E-commerce through eBay or through retail have enabled you to buy games when beforehand, if you didn't have a games shop in your town, there's nothing you could do about that. YouTube, you can learn how to play games from people like Dice Tower. You can read board game reviews to see which games are for you and whether they are worth buying on BoardGameGeek.com. And of course, last but not least, Kickstarters enable games that would never be made to be made, because it's a direct-to-consumer proposition. In the old days, if the games designer decided to publish their own game, they'd print 5,000, of which 4,900 would probably be in their garage forever and a day. But now, effectively pre-selling through Kickstarter, you can reach a global audience through e-commerce and get your game funded up front, which is happy days. So, and you've seen, of course, huge companies come out of this new ecosystem.
Well, if you are looking for any kind of review or how to play or anything like that, then you can, of course, go over to my father website, dicebreaker.com.
Yeah.
But we are reaching the end of our interview here.
Well, I hope you reviewed my board games.
Well, we've done some live playthroughs of Fighting Fantasy in front of audiences at events, actually. So if that's the kind of thing that you're after, then you can hit two birds with one stone by heading over to dicebreaker.com. But Ian, I'll give you a chance now just to plug anything that you want to have people reach out to, or any social channels that people can follow you on.
Well, if anyone wants to contact me or just follow me, you can on Twitter. I'm at Ian_Livingstone. I'm writing a couple of books at the moment. One is just delivered to a publisher, which is the book's called Dice Men. You can still buy it from Unbound, a crowdfunding publisher. It's about the first 10 years of Games Workshop, all the anecdotes and hard luck stories of when we were living in a van during those early days of Workshop. And if you want to read about some of the games I like playing in the board games world, please buy Board Games in 100 Moves, and of course any Fighting Fantasy game book that takes your fancy.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Ian. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Great.
And please enjoy the rest of the event if you're watching this live. You can, as I said, head over to youtube.com/Dicebreaker or dicebreaker.com to find more from me. But like I said, enjoy the rest of the event. Have a lovely week or weekend whenever you're watching this. And thanks very much for watching. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.